Hey, great to have you here. So back today with another horror movie review video, and today we are going to be reviewing The Babadook. And this is probably be a little bit quicker review just because the movie's not super long and concepts overall don't feel like they take too much in depth to talk about, but either way, we'll take a look at this one. This is one I watched a few years ago, a while back at this point actually. I think it came out in like 2014, so I probably watched it a little bit after that. Just recently rewatched it. I wasn't a big fan of it when it first came out. I feel like I got kind of the concept of it, but it didn't have a whole lot of interest for me, but I figured I'd give it another rewatch and just overall discuss it here with you guys today. So The Babadook, for folks who aren't aware, is kind of a concept of somewhat of a metaphor where you're dealing with mental illness. I think it's like the big focal point of this movie. So this is more of an indie type film, a little bit more artsy than your typical horror slasher that you would experience. This is more high level horror. This movie starts with, we have a mother who has a kid who's a little bit disobedient. He's having a lot of trouble in school. He's misbehaving constantly and getting in fights and just causing problems for the class. And he winds up getting disciplined to a point where the school's recommending, hey, you may want to have another plan here for this kid. And the mom's reluctant to do that. Overall, the big plot point is that it sounds like when the kid was born, they were rushing to the hospital and the dad died in a car accident. I don't know how the mom would have been negatively impacted by that, because if he's driving her to the hospital, and how did the mom and the kid survive? I don't know exactly, but either way, the dad passed away, taking the mom to the hospital. Then we fast forward time, we have the kid who's around 6 years old and the mom at this point. And as mentioned, the kid is misbehaving. He has a lot of violent tendencies. And on the mom's side, she has a lot of grief and depression, just, I think, with the father passing away and a lot of guilt associated with that. I think she puts a lot of blame probably on the kid at this point. It's hard for them to live together without that father figure in their life, because there's a lot of just tension between those two folks. So that's kind of the driving force of this movie. They wind up getting this book called The Babadook, and they read it through, and the mother soon realizes, hey, this book is a little bit darker than I was expecting. But the kid's like, no, I picked this one out. So she keeps reading, and it's clearly a little bit heavy as far as the subject material for a child. She winds up like changing the words when she's like finishing it, because she reads it to herself and she's like, wow, this is rough. So she changes the words, but either way, they're still impacted from reading the book. And there are parts throughout the movie where she tries to get rid of the book and it comes back to her doorstep, like she catches it on fire. She tries to go to the police and say, hey, someone's messing with me. And he's like, where's the book? And she's like, well, I burned it. So he's like, well, I can't do anything about that. She sees like signs of the Babadook periodically, like when she's in that police headquarters, she sees like a top hat and a little gown as well. So she's seeing this elsewhere. She's out driving at one point and gets in a car wreck, and it's in theory due to the Babadook impacting that. So a lot going on there, and there's just a lot of tension building up, and there's not a whole lot of characters in this movie. It's mostly the kid and his mom, and then there's some extra characters like his cousins as well that he winds up breaking her nose. So a few other extras, but it's mostly the kid and the mom in their house, and she starts to see stuff and just is freaking out and just having a hard time being a parent with all this going on in her head. And then time progresses, she starts seeing the Babadook more and more. And just really the point of this is just kind of that grief, I think, is it's really going for that perspective of, hey, grief and depression can impact people a lot of different ways. It's showing kind of a physical form of what this looks like, because a lot of times if someone's not physically hurt, we just kind of assume they're fine. And this really takes a physical form of what some of those mental health issues can look like. So I do appreciate the concept here. It's an interesting metaphor to use. I think a lot of people probably debate whether or not the Babadook is actually a thing, because technically it's a metaphor for grief and just any kind of mental issue you may be dealing with. But there's things where she's being interacted with the Babadook. So you can view it either as being in existence because of her grief, or she's making it up and it is entirely her grief. So either way you want to spin it, but they ultimately get to a point where she gets consumed by the Babadook and she starts being super crazy and just yelling at her kid, and they're just growing more and more tension between the two of them. And I don't know how the kid puts this like elaborate plan to like trip up the mom and stuff like that, but ultimately traps her. She's like freaking out, and she winds up eventually vomiting out this black, like blood looking goo. And in theory, that's like the Babadook coming out of her at that point. So she has released it, and then her and her son go upstairs and close the basement door and lock it. And from there, we're just supposed to assume she now has the Babadook trapped in her basement. and she periodically will feed it, like she's giving it worms at the end of the movie. And also super sad at one point, she winds up killing the dog when she's like possessed by the Babadook, and at the end you see it's kind of like buried at that point where she's getting the worms from. But she goes down at the end and gives the Babadook the worms, and it like takes it and throws it, and she goes up to her kids. She's like, oh yeah, not too bad of a day with him today. He does like a magic trick, and the movie kind of just ends. But I think the point is she didn't get rid of the Babadook. She didn't get rid of her grief or her depression. She's just feeding it or keeping it at bay. So she's keeping that part of her alive, because it's hard to fully kill something like that. It's just, let me just manage this as best as possible. So she just tends to it periodically, seems to be the message sending there. And also the basement's kind of where the father's stuff was. So that location specifically makes sense for where that's where the Babadook is at, because the father is really all-encompassing of why this creature came about, just because of the mother's perspective of the situation, as well as the son's now misbehaviors that have resulted kind of from the situation. So overall, interesting concept. I think the only con I have would be like, I get it's a little bit more of an artsy film. I feel like there's long stretches where I feel like it's kind of boring to me. I do appreciate the concept of it and the idea of having this mental health situation be physically represented, and in this monster just highlighting what this is like for somebody. But I don't really enjoy watching the movie, if I'm honest. Like, I like the idea, but I don't like the execution or just the consuming of it. It's not interesting to me, and there's not a whole lot of payoff that happens throughout the movie. It just feels like it's a bit of a slow burn, and there's never any real culminating moment. It just kind of ends at some point. So, well, like, as I said, I feel like I've broken record here, but I do appreciate the idea. I like the concept, and I think movies like this have a certain place in horror. It just didn't work for me personally, and not something that I see myself really rewatching going forward in the future. And I know this is really highly thought of, so apologies if this may be a different viewpoint than you have, but for a score for this movie, I'm going to give this one a 3 out of 10. I know that's below average, but I do think it gets some points for doing a bit of a creative idea for a monster and representing it in an effective way. The acting by the mother especially was, I think, overall pretty solid, so I do respect a lot that was done in this movie. It's just not a movie for me, if that makes sense. So that is The Babadook. Would love to hear your thoughts. As I said, I think this is really highly regarded in the horror community. Like, I think its Rotten Tomato score is extremely high. So if you have a different viewpoint, would love to see your thoughts there. Maybe why you personally really love the movie. Just would love to see all the feedback down below regarding The Babadook itself. So appreciate you guys so much for watching, and I hope to talk to you again soon.